Okay, so the other organs of the endocrine system, we're going to talk about a few more, some of the important ones that are pretty high yield on the MCAT. And one of the more important ones is the thyroid gland. So if you look at the left, it's that sort of symmetric gland that sits in your neck. So the thyroid is a two-lobed endocrine gland that sits in the center of the neck below the Adam's apple in humans. And its main function is to regulate metabolism and balance calcium levels in the blood. So we mostly know it for its metabolism regulation. I'm sure you guys have come across like hypothyroidism and its effects. The thyroid is something I think that the MCAT does like to test. I've seen a lot about hyper and hypothyroidism on it, and it'll ask you, like, you have to have knowledge of how the thyroid gland works into the hormonal and endocrine system in order to answer the questions. So its main function, said that it regulates metabolism by producing two hormones in response to TSH released by the pituitary gland. So remember flat peg, the T in flat peg is TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone is a tropic hormone because it is acting on another endocrine gland to release different hormones. So it's a releasing factor, basically. And the two hormones that are released by the thyroid are T3 and T4, which is what they're more commonly known as. T3 is triiodothyronine and T4 is thyroxine. So both of them basically do the same thing. They're just slightly different. I think T3 has one less iodine than T4, but they both increase the basal metabolic rate when they're released into circulation. So I think one of them is faster acting. I think T4 might be faster acting. But they both do the same thing. It's not super important that you strike a difference between the two. They're both released by the thyroid and they increase basal metabolic rate. But on top of the thyroid's role in regulating basal metabolic rate, it also has specialized C cells that release calcitonin. So calcitonin counteracts the effects of parathyroid hormone, which we'll talk about in a minute, and it decreases blood calcium level. So calcitonin decreases blood calcium level. It can increase calcium storages on your bone. It can act on your intestines to decrease calcium reuptake. It can act on your kidneys also to decrease calcium reuptake. But that is what calcitonin does. It decreases your calcium levels in the blood, and parathyroid hormone does the opposite. So again, I don't really have a great mnemonic for remembering those two. You kind of just have to remember them. I still sometimes get the two of them confused, but you definitely want to keep them straight for the MCAT. So what we were just talking about, the parathyroid hormone, parathyroid glands, excuse me. Humans have 4 rice-sized parathyroid hormones. Parathyroid gland situated behind the thyroid gland. So if you look at this graphic to the right, it shows the thyroid gland like we saw in the last one, and you see these 4 little dots that are sort of sitting 2 on either lobe of the thyroid gland. Those are the parathyroid glands. So they're very tiny, but it's because they only have one function, basically. So the thyroid secretes calcitonin to reduce blood calcium levels. The parathyroid gland secretes parathyroid hormones to increase blood calcium levels. So they sort of work in tandem to adjust your calcium level because it's a pretty important ion. It's involved in a lot of nervous signaling and a lot of muscular contraction. So it's important to note that this is the only function of the parathyroid hormone. So as appropriate calcium levels in the bone and blood are vital for normal bodily functioning. Right. So it mitigates blood calcium levels, but it's also important to look at bone calcium levels. When bone calcium levels drop too low, that's how osteoporosis develops. The bones can get brittle, they can break. So these two are pretty important. And like I said before, I think the MCAT pretty often does like to test sort of deficiencies in this sort of calcium system. And next we are going to talk about the pancreas. So the pancreas is involved in digestion as well as the body's endocrine functioning. So you'll see it come up in the digestion lectures, and you'll also see it come up in lectures about hormones in the endocrine system. During digestion, the pancreas secretes digestive enzymes that are released through a duct into the intestines. So I'm sure you've learned about those enzymes. We're not going to go too much into them because since they are released into a duct and they're not released into the blood, they're considered exocrine enzymes. It's an exocrine function, so it's not technically considered a true endocrine function. So it's a little bit outside of the scope of this specific lecture, but we do have a digestion lecture that's probably going to touch upon a lot of the stuff that I'm about to talk about. I think it's next week, but this is a great, this and the next few slides that I'm going to do are a great, it's great groundwork for you to understand the digestive lecture a little bit better from an endocrine perspective. The pancreas also has tiny clumps of specialized endocrine cells known as the islets of Langerhans, which we mentioned a little bit earlier. So these cells produce insulin and glucagon, among a few others. I think it might also produce somatostatin. But insulin and glucagon are really the two that I see the most on the MCAT. They're both peptide hormones, like we were talking about before. So remember, they are water soluble. They readily dissolve into blood plasma, and they affect receptors that are on the cell membrane. They don't diffuse through because they are not lipophilic. They are hydrophilic. So this is an example of an endocrine organ that is not directly controlled by the pituitary gland. I just wanted to throw that in there just to contrast it from the HPA axis, because the pituitary gland does have a lot of endocrine control over the body. But insulin and glucagon are controlled by a bunch of other factors. It's time of day, your circadian rhythm, the food that you intake in your stomach. Those are all factors that affect insulin and glucagon secretion. Yep, cool, Janelle confirmed. So insulin, glucagon, and somatostatin, and I'm pretty sure somatostatin is, yeah, I think they come from the delta cells in the islets of Langerhans. Okay, so the ovaries and testes are another target cell and a point of interest when we're studying the endocrine system. So the pituitary gland can also release hormones that directly affect sexual functioning in both males and females. So follicle stimulating hormone, like we talked about in Janelle's previous reproduction lecture toward the beginning of the program, they help the maturation of primary oocytes into mature ova in females. And it is also present in males too. It helps the production of sperm, which takes place primarily in Sertoli cells. Luteinizing hormone helps the production of estrogen in females, and it encourages ovulation in females. So like we spoke about, FSH and LH are huge players in ovulation in females. Luteinizing hormone is sort of that last interaction that actually allows ovulation in females. The egg comes out of the follicle. In males, luteinizing hormone stimulates the production of testosterone from the cells of Leydig. And along with producing gametes, the ovaries and testes produce sex hormones that contribute to the body's normal metabolism. So they do produce gametes. We have ova and sperm that are produced. We know that that is basically their primary function, but they're also super important in regulating sex hormones throughout the body. So they contribute just to the body's normal metabolism, and they also help develop secondary sex characteristics during development, specifically during puberty. All right, so all of you said D. An increase in the anterior pituitary lobe function would most probably directly increase blood concentration levels of which of the following? Awesome job, that is correct. TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone, and that is one of the 7 flat peg. So if pituitary lobe function is going to increase, we would probably expect to see, out of these 4 at least, we would expect to see an increase in TSH. So great job with that. Vasopressin, remember, is also known as AVP, arginine vasopressin, antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and that is created by the hypothalamus and it's secreted by the posterior lobe. So anterior pituitary lobe function would not affect it. And same thing with oxytocin, and insulin comes from the pancreas like we spoke about before. There are a lot of other factors that are affecting it. So yeah, D is correct. You guys all got it. Awesome job.